digital transformation. So with that, I'd like to invite everyone throughout the presentation to feel free to ask questions at any time using the console from your GoToWebinar panel. And then at the conclusion, time pending, we'll open it up to questions as well and answer those. And so we'll get started right now by handing off to our presenter, Avi Cavalli. He's the CEO and co-founder of Shippable. He's been working in ops and DevOps for the past 17 years, has learned much throughout that time that has been built in to the products that we do at Shippable, and most importantly, the learnings that we're going to be talking about today inside the webinar. So Avi, I'll hand it off to you, and you can take over from here.
Thanks, Tom. Just a quick question. Can everybody see my screen at this point of time? Hey, Manisha, Tom, can you see my screen?
Yes, it's coming through. Thanks.
Okay, cool, perfect. So thanks everybody for being here. So what I'm going to do is quickly walk through a few slides and set the context, and I want to spend most of my time today in actually building out the entire pipeline using different tools. I'll walk through the tools and using Shippable as a backbone to build that automation. So what we are...
Did you stop sharing?
No, I didn't.
Tom, can you still see your screen?
No, it stopped. It's back to the title.
So, yeah, it's back now. Thanks. Go ahead, Eric. Sorry.
Can you see it?
Yeah.
Okay, just let me know if in case it drops off.
Yep.
Okay, so we started Shippable in 2013. Manisha and I were the founders. We are about 33 now. We're based out of Seattle and Bangalore. We have a pretty large SaaS customer base. Like we have about 75,000 people who use our product and about 8,000 organizations. And we've done Series A with about $10 million of funding raised. And so the context of Shippable is that...
your screen is no longer sharing.
Huh.
Looks like we might be having some technical difficulties.
No?
Yep, it's coming through now.
Okay. So the context of why we started doing Shippable was that enterprises are going through digital transformation.
Sorry, we lost it again. We seem to be having.
So if I use full screen, we lose it, I think.
Yeah, so maybe
don't. Just don't do full screen. Okay.
So I'll just try to. Okay, perfect. So as I was saying, enterprises are going through a digital transformation, and for years and years and years, delivering software is being a bit of a challenge. I mean, it has a ton of friction, and a lot of things have tried to be agile, but everybody has become agile in a local fashion. But if you look at the total life cycle of how an application goes from a developer's machine all the way into a production server and eventually makes it to a customer's device, that entire workflow is anything but agile. And in the last few years, DevOps has become the answer to try to make this like as agile and frictionless as possible. But what we saw was a significant number of organizations struggle to achieve this. And the main reasons for that is that we believe that most of the current solutions are very primitive. And what I mean by that is they rely heavily on scripting, and a ton of stuff that gets embedded into those scripts make it like kind of pretty primitive in terms of how things were being done. And as a result of this, what ends up happening is these scripts become inflexible and fragile. And they are very rarely composable, so everything starts becoming like a stovepipe solution. And eventually, the DevOps automation itself starts crumbling on the weight of its own, excuse me, number of pieces of automation that's been done. And most importantly also, even if you try to automate all of these things, most of the solutions are very, very fragmented. I mean, so there are tons and tons of pieces of solutions that all solve a particular problem, and most customers or most users of this kind of technology will have to chain them all together using some sort of scripting technology or anything. I mean, that's kind of how we saw the fundamental problems were. And then, so what we have tried to do is develop a systematic map on how to achieve this DevOps success. And you have to always remember that zero-touch automation is the goal. And that doesn't mean that you have to be deploying straight to production. But what it needs to mean is that if you want to do it, you should be able to do it. And even if you say, hey, I want an operations person to push the button, it should be just pushing the button and not really going SSHing into a bunch of servers and doing things with it. So with that being as a goal, we have the way we look at DevOps is broken into 4 different blocks. It's provisioning, the build, CI, packaging part of it, the testing part of it, and eventually the release and deployment of it. And what you even though you have to do this in these 4 stages, you also have to do it across all your environments. You can't just say I'm automated only in a particular place or a particular pillar in a particular place. So you have to really try to get the entire automation happening. So the vision is that for every single application in your organization, you're going to try to move the automation as far to the right as possible across all these stages. And that's kind of how we think about the systematic map of DevOps. And then, so if you kind of look at that systematic map where automation is the center block, what we have seen is that it is built on these 4 core pillars. The number 1 pillar is you got to have a job runtime. I mean, all your complete enterprise needs to be using a common image format or a common image on which all your applications are getting built. Otherwise, they will always have these problems of it runs on my machine, but it doesn't run in production or things like that. So the job runtime, the packaging of all of that, making sure what versions are installed, all of that stuff needs to be centrally managed as a job runtime system. The second piece is the state management. I mean, as your DevOps is actually flowing through, just running a particular task is not enough. You got to know what are all the different tasks that are running, when was it last run, what is the actual version that was stable, and not just that, it also is any kind of artifacts like IP addresses in automation, or AMI IDs if you're building images, or Docker container tags if you're building Docker containers. All of these things need to be systemically available, and that is anybody in your organization needs to be able to say, hey, give me the latest dev version of API, and I should be able to get it through some sort of a API, pardon the pun, some sort of an API out of it. And then in terms of the third pillar, it's the visibility that we are talking about. So if you kind of look at the 1960s Japanese model of how a factory floor looked like, you could pretty much see the entire factory of how things were being manufactured on a single screen. And you want the same thing for your application automation across your entire workflow. So you need to be able to see everything in one single pane. It's kind of like a way to say, rather than going and looking at each individual thing, what the status is, you should be able to visually get that particular information. You want to have a ton of analytics. You want to have like whether code is degrading, code is improving on a particular application. A lot of these things have to be completely transparent, and anybody in the company should be able to see all this information. And the last pillar is the operations piece of it, which is how do you do deployments? How do you do scale? I mean, most of the times people talk about elastic scale. Elastic scale is nothing other than a deployment with more instances. So that thing has to hook into your automation framework. You want to be able to kind of do things like, hey, I want to do a deployment into production, and I want to look at the percentage of errors that I have seen in the last 1 hour in comparison to historical percentage of errors. And if something is funky, I want to roll back automatically. All of these kind of telemetry has to feed into the automation framework. So that's kind of how we've thought about how a DevOps platform needs to look like. And what Shippable is exactly in that kind of format. So we have standard image libraries, variables, and anything that you want to do serverless or behind the firewall, all of that stuff is all part of our job runtime area. From a state perspective, we give you a secret store for encrypted variables or any kind of secrets that you want to manage or configurations you want to manage. And you want to have service discovery as part of that state, and more importantly, you want your DevOps state to be maintained there. So pretty much everything about your pipeline. From a visibility perspective, we have this thing called Single Pane of Glass, which actually gives you an end-to-end view of your application pipeline, not just for a particular application, it's every single application that exists in your organization. You can customize it. You can create a maturity scorecard to kind of measure where you are from your DevOps maturity perspective. And of course, from an operation perspective, we have a monitor that allows you to put data back into the automation pipeline, which allows us to kind of figure out how to scale up, scale down, roll back, roll forward, all of that stuff. And that's basically the pillar of it. And of course, it's built on top of all the different tools and technologies and plugins that you have to use. The idea here is that a lot of companies have done some sorts of investments already. We really are not suggesting that you should be throwing all these things out. You can plug and play all of those things and extend wherever you don't have those pieces according to the DevOps maturity model that we were talking about. And that's pretty much from a presentation perspective. So what I want to do is jump into how to actually do this end to end. And what I'm doing today is I'm using a bunch of tools, and I want to talk about, like we do IaaS automation using Terraform. We are using Packer to build the AMIs. It's a Java application with Maven as a build technology. I'm also using Docker as part of the packaging here. I'm in Amazon ECS hosting on top of Docker. And then I'm using JUnit and Kobertura for like unit testing framework. And of course, it's getting deployed to ECS. So that being said, I'm going to just jump in straight into my application. So I have a very simple Java application here, and I'll send the links out in the end where people, if you want to look at it, download it and play with it, you can do it. This is nothing fancy in this Java application. It's a very simple, it's a sample application that Apache actually ships with. What I'm actually showing you is the YAML configuration of Shippable, which tells you how to actually do a CI. And Shippable is kind of completely code-driven as opposed to UI-driven. So you can pretty much do everything in your Git repository. So simple things, it's using an Oracle JDK 8. We are using a Docker container to bring up the base image, which is running on U14, Ubuntu 14. And I'm doing a bunch of commands here. I'm installing Maven, and eventually I'm going to build a hello world var, and then once it's tested completely using this particular Maven build, then I'm going to push it to JFrog as an artifact repository, and then I'm pretty much done. So one key thing here is Shippable does is that this is the secrets management that I was talking about. There is no username and password that is in your YAML file. We use integrations to actually do it. So the integration, what I mean by that is if you jump into the settings here, this is Shippable UI, by the way. You can log in into www.shippable.com, and you can sign in with GitHub or Bitbucket, and you will see the UI something like this. And on the integration side, so these are some of the integrations that I'm using for today's webinar. This is what Shippable is very, very powerful about. You can integrate all of these things centrally. So I have a JFrog integration here, which I have defined. The username and password went into this integration. It has a pointer called demo.jf, and in my entire webinar or entire YAML files, wherever I'm using in this webinar, I'm just going to use this pointer. I'm also using an AWS key, an AWS PEM. There's a Docker Hub integration as well as a GitHub integration, which are some of the key things that I'm using for this webinar. And so the idea is you create all these integrations centrally, you publish out whatever names that you want to publish out to your entire organization, and they can just use it in their YAML. And you can give permissions, revoke permissions, all using this particular UI. And that being said, so what I have done is I've already enabled this project. And if you see, like I have a sample Java Tomcat, and then what it's going to do is it's going to generate a var file when it actually runs. This is the Spog view of Shippable, which gives you the pipeline. And in addition to it, I have automation repository called demo pipes. and everything is stored in demo pipes, basically in terms of configuration of how application workflows need to be. All my IaaS automation, all of that, I have put it into this particular repository, and I have hooked that repository into my Spog, and that is very simple. You just click this plus button and you can actually add it. You can add any repository you want using the GitHub integration. And that's how I added it. And what it does is it reads 2 of the files. So all of Shippable can be configured with 3 YAML files. One is the CI YAML file, which actually tells you the build instructions. The other YAML file we have is what we call as the resources.yaml. And what this defines is every single resource that will be used in your entire pipeline. So the beauty of this is if you have the same resource that need to be used multiple times, you define it once, you create a pointer to it, and then you start using it in all your pipelines. And all of this is going to be made up of resources, and then anything you want to do as an operation on top of that resource is actually a job. And so obviously it's called shippable.jobs.yaml. And I'll walk through exactly what these things mean, but at a fundamental level, that's how I actually configured this. And now jumping into my JFrog, I have a JFrog registry or a repository here called builds. It has nothing in it at this point of time. And what I'm going to do is do a very, very simple commit onto my Java application, nothing fancy. I'm just going to try to edit this. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to just commit this. Assume that this is a developer trying to do something, and I'm going to do a git push. So Shippable is integrated into the GitHub right now as a webhook. So this should, in a moment, actually fire a webhook into Shippable, and Shippable will start actually processing that particular build. Let me try and refresh to make sure my web sockets are connected. Yeah, there you go. So what that did is, I mean, while I enabled, we automatically created all the workflows that we wanted to connect to GitHub. And this is actually firing a build, and you can actually see the console run through in a moment on how this actually is kind of working through. I think I'm getting a lot of those with my Chrome. So this is going to run through. So that being said, while, as you see, it's starting to provision, it's starting to run the job, and it's going to boot the container of U14. It's pulling Maven and running through that entire workflow. And you can also see the moment this finishes, what we will do is we will run this particular thing into this particular builds, and you will see a hello world var there. And that's a basic CI workflow. Pretty much every single CI tool you want to use will do this, whether it's Jenkins, whether it is Circle CI, or any kind of tool that you want to use. You can actually get this thing done and push it to JFrog. And of course, the value of Shippable is it can run CI, but that's not where it stops. It also can do more things around it. So this just finished. Actually, I don't know why I lost my screen. Let me just refresh this. So this has finished and gave me build 38, and you should see the console here. And if I open up the build CI part, which was all my YAML instructions, you will actually see the YAML instructions here. And in the end, I actually pushed it to JFrog, and it uploaded an artifact into JFrog. It ran through all my tests. And I can also go to my tests folder here and see that I had a couple of tests on this that are passing. You can get coverage. All of that is kind of built into the product, where if you export the files into the right format, Shippable will actually parse it for you and give you all that information. This is from a CI perspective. Now, if I go refresh it here, I should actually see the artifact. Yep, there it is. So there is the hello world var that got pushed. So we are done from the CI part of it. Now what I want to do is I want to actually push my infrastructure into AWS. So if I go to AWS, I don't have anything at this point of time. This is completely a brand new EC2 account, which has just an IAM account for myself, and I just have a key pair that I'm going to use to actually provision machines on it. So what I'm going to do is first I'm going to say, hey, I want a repository for doing my automation, and that's what I'm trying to say is that's my demo pipes. And it has the format of this structure is very simple. And before that, I also want to just talk about this. This was the demo file that we just built from CI. I'm also creating a reference here saying, hey, I want to use the same demo.jf, which was the integration that we created. I have a pointer to hello world var here, which is with the path on JFrog Artifactory. And this is what I want to use in my workflow. And I'm also creating a repository for all my automation code that is going to exist here. And I'm also creating one more piece of resource, which is actually my key, which I'm going to use, which is my demo key that allows me to connect to AWS. So instead of putting in the AWS key and the password or the secret and everything into the actual code and trying to encrypt that and all of it, we have this secret store, which allows us to abstract all that thing away. So I'm also setting up a bunch of parameters. This is telling me some of the source AMI I'm going to use, what VPC I'm going to bring this up in, subnet and stuff like that. You can extend this. These are just environment variables that I'm creating. And I'm also going to go and create a PEM key. This is what Amazon PEM key is, so that my Terraform file can actually SSH into the machine. So these are some of the resources that I need for my automation. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use these resources in my actual automation. So let me just uncomment this first. So there are actually 4 blocks to it. There is an infrastructure setup, which will give me the security groups and all those things that I want to do. This is not going to be run often, so I've kind of separated that out into a separate job. And then I'm going to build an AMI. I'm using Packer to do it, and I'll show you the AMI script for it. And then I'm going to provision my test infrastructure and then my production infrastructure. And as you see, the workflow of this, the structure of these jobs are very, very simple. I do whatever resources I want as ints, and then I run whatever script I want to do, and then on success, on failure, I can run different kinds of scripts if I want to run on top of it. Here in this case, if in case my build AMI fails, I'm just catting the output of whatever Packer is generating so that I can actually debug and see what's actually happening. One other key feature we have is the switch off. So if you, I'll talk about the switch off, what it actually does. It basically allows you to control the flow. If you do switch off, it won't automatically trigger. You have to manually go and trigger if this particular resource changes. So this is kind of the structure of how it is. So let me just commit this, and so we can visually see how this looks like. So I'm just going to add all the infra jobs into my commit, and I'm going to just push. So what this will do is, again, we have a webhook into the demo pipes, which is the GitHub repository. I just pushed it. So this just fired. It's going to run through all my YAML changes that I made. And you will see the entire pipeline repaint with all the new flows that I've actually done. That should take about a few seconds. This should run through. Yep, that's done. And then you should see, yep, there you go. So that's the pipeline that we just built. So whatever I was talking about is, if you kind of walk through this, I have build params, I have a repository that has all the source code, I have the AWS creds, which actually is going to be used in my build AMI job. And then this actually has a dependency to my infrastructure setup. And since I set the switch to off, this is dotted. That means anytime this succeeds, this will not automatically fire this, which is my infrastructure. And this will set up the IAM, and then I have my test infra provisioning and production infra provisioning sitting here. Anytime I finish my infrastructure setup, I want to actually provision the actual cluster, which is an ECS cluster on the system. So what I'm going to do is, instead of committing all of this changes, I'm just going to right click here and say run. So what this is going to do is it's going to fire my AMI build job. And it started running, and it's going to start going through its entire workflow. And it's starting to process all the dependencies that it has, and eventually it will start running my AMI workflow. And so if you kind of watch this, it's starting to log in into Amazon, and it's starting to run, and there you go, it's actually validating my AMI script, and it's now waiting for Amazon to actually spin up a machine on which we're going to build an AMI for. So I'm going to jump to Amazon. If you go to running instances now, you should actually see a machine's booting up, which is actually going to build my Packer image for it. And once this image is done, I will actually snapshot it, create an AMI for myself, and I'm going to use that AMI to actually deploy my ECS configuration. And the reason I'm doing this is while this is finishing, I'm going to show you the AMI code here, which is my build AMI. And if you look at my Packer code, so this is where I'm running my Packer code here, which is how I'm actually saying, hey, this is my image. And if you look at all of these environment variables, these were all the things that we actually gave it as inputs into our system. So all the configuration and everything, it comes in as environment variables into your build engine, and that's how you can actually use it in your script to actually run. So with about like few lines of code, like about 20, 30 lines of code, with really no hard-coded secrets or anything, you can actually build a Packer image and run through it. And that's basically what this is happening. Let me see what the status is. So yeah, I mean, it's already finished, and it's stopping now, and it's going to try and image it. So if you look at it, instance will stop, and an AMI image is actually going to get built. So while that finishes, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you my Terraform file, which is actually my provisioning script. So while that is finishing, I have to wait until that finishes. So if I look at my test Terraform file, these are all native Terraform files as you would use. And I'm using a variables file to actually create all my variables that are going to get injected into this. And my provisioning of my Terraform is very, very straightforward. I'm just creating a few environment variables, which is my auto repo, my credentials, and my PEM. And then eventually I'm running basically this command, which is, where is this? Yeah, here. So which is the Terraform plan and Terraform apply. And I actually am sending in the credentials of whatever I set it up into my job, which is basically, if you look at it, it says AWS creds. And this is AWS creds here, which is going as an input into my actual job. So I think this should run for another few seconds, and I think this runs for about a minute to 2 minutes. Yeah. While it finishes creating the AMI. So it's waiting for the AMI to finish. So let's jump in here. Yep, AMI is available, so my job should be done almost in a few seconds now. So this is the way we actually create AMIs at Shippable. We have standard AMIs that we use across our entire infrastructure. So this job finished. So what I'm going to do is I'm also going to trigger my infrastructure setup. And you have to remember, I'm just manually triggering it, but all of these are actually in a repository. So if you make a git commit to this repository, this will automatically trigger the entire workflow. So now I'm running through my IAM creation on all the AWS, and you will see once this finishes, since the test infrastructure provisioning and the prod infrastructure provisioning are happening immediately after this finishes, you will see this dynamically trigger these two. Right, there you go. So this is basically a pipeline that's getting generated. So we built the AMI, we set up some IAM credentials for ourselves, and then that is being used as an input into creating these two pieces of infrastructure, which is a prod infrastructure, which is a cluster on ECS, and a test infrastructure, which is another cluster on ECS. So once these two finish, if I go to AWS now, you should start seeing those instances starting to come up. While that finishes, let me just So let us start running, and you will start seeing all the machines get created. So yeah, there you go. It's actually starting to create all my machines that I require and all the security groups and all of it. So I let that finish, and I think you should see the machines now. Yeah, there you go. So all the AMIs got created. Now I'm actually starting to provision my prod and test cluster. If I go to ECS right now in terms of container service, you will actually see the two clusters. There is nothing there. Once the machine comes up, you will see the two clusters. Oh, there you go. So the prod AWS and test AWS are created. Once the container boots up, or the container instances boot up, this will get set up. So that's the infrastructure piece end to end on how that actually works. So now with that being said, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to my demo pipes, and I'm going to start working through the Docker build and workflows. So for this one, what I'm going to need is my Docker credentials, which is just an integration to Docker Hub. And I have a repository, which is the sample Java Tomcat, and I'm using the branch Docker to actually build a Docker container. And then I'm actually going to be running this into an image called demo doc image, and I'm going to push it to my Docker repository under the name sample Java Tomcat. And then I'm setting some Docker options for whenever it runs. And this is like I'm giving it like a quarter of memory and a quarter of CPU on whatever the machine has. And I'm exposing port 8080 against which the application will actually be running. And I also am creating a reference to my two clusters. So my infrastructure actually created my test AWS cluster, which is put into the source name here. And I also have another cluster called prod AWS. And I have one more for the production, which is what I'm calling it a scaler, which is actually replicas. And so if you want to control how many instances of a container is going to come up on production, this can be changed dynamically. You can make it 5, you can make it 4. That's basically the reason why I want to control the replica. So those are all the pieces of resources that I'm using to manage my Docker container and push it to ECS. On the job side, I'm going to open up the first one, which is basically the build of the Docker container. It's just going to compile, it'll download the hello world war file, and then it will actually build it into a container and then push it into an image. And if you look at here, we introduced this thing called out, which means that's the resource that's getting outputted from this particular work. And then in terms of my options, I'm creating a manifest, which is actually the definition of what gets deployed to ECS. In ECS, you can call it, they call it task definition. And the advantage of using a manifest is you can create one single manifest and deploy it into any cloud. So in this case, where you're deploying it into ECS. So the reason why we introduced manifest is ability to abstract so that you can have some containers running on ECS, some containers running on any sort, whether it's Kubernetes, whether it's Mesos, whether it is Docker data center, it doesn't really matter. So that's the advantage of using manifest, as it abstracts those things out. And then I'm going to do a deployment into my test, and I'm going to do a deployment into my prod. So these are the workflows. So if you kind of watch the ins and outs in my prod, I'm looking for prod infrastructure to be done. And I'm also adding my scaler. I'm also saying my input has to come from test, as in if test has succeeded, that's the only time I want to actually deploy a production. I'm giving it an environment, which is actually the cluster, and this is a managed task, and that's why I'm naming it as managed. So that's the structure of production. It follows the same thing in whether it is prod, test, anything, it's the same syntax. So it's very easy to learn, and it's ins and outs and scripts, and that's basically what this entire thing is. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to commit this the same way, adding build, push. So the moment I do that, you will actually see the pipeline get completely changed in terms of what the changes I actually made. This should fire in a few seconds. While I'm waiting for that, let me just go and look at my provisioning on AWS. If you see now, this has 2 container instances running under prod. It has 1 container instance under test. So this was exactly what we named as our cluster, test AWS and prod AWS. It's referring to it by name. And yeah, it just started firing. It's going to finish that in a few seconds, and you will see the workflow of how the Docker workflow is now. Give it a few seconds. It should be about like usually 10-15 seconds. While it's doing that, I'm going to switch out my branch to Docker so that I can actually see the code. So if I go back into my sample Java Tomcat, I'll show you how the structure is. There's a build file here which has a bunch of environment variables based on the actual credentials that I actually input, the credentials, the repository, the image, and all of that. And what I'm doing is a very, very simple JFrog download of the hello world that we just uploaded in the previous task. I'm doing a Docker build, and I'm doing a Docker push, and I'm just creating a state file to tell me which version of Docker file did I actually run. And my Docker file is super straightforward. It's just basically what it's doing is it's inheriting from Tomcat Docker image, and it's removing the hello world var if it existed in the web apps folder, and it's copying the new hello world var into it, and it's going to create a packaged container for me that I can actually deploy. I mean, that's basically all my Docker file is actually doing. Oh wow, this is still running. I want to see. Yeah, it's just starting to create all the dependencies, so it should be done pretty soon. So what this is doing is it's walking through your entire YAML and making sure it manages all the dependency, and it actually looks like it succeeded. And we should just see this get painted very quickly. Yep, there you go. So yeah, there you go. So if you look at how the pipeline got developed right now, what it did is, this was my original CI repo, which did the sample Java Tomcat, push it into a demo var. This is a dependency for my creating my Docker var file, which is basically a Docker container with a var in it. It is taking in my Docker credentials. Output of it is a Docker image, which is here. And then this is getting into a manifest, which is taking in the image options, which is all that memory and ports and all that stuff, creating a manifest. And the manifest is actually getting pushed into test deployment. And test deployment requires test infrastructure. Hence, that's the pipeline for that test. And if infrastructure gets provisioned, test will not automatically deploy. But every single time manifest changes, test deployment will automatically occur. And then there is a prod infrastructure, which is if test is green, then only I want to actually deploy to prod. I mean, this is kind of the entire workflow now. So what you're seeing is AMI getting built, IAM got set up, infrastructure got provisioned, CI ran on this particular Java Tomcat, var file got created, Docker container using that var file got created, then a manifest got created, test deployment, and production deployment. So this is the entire workflow that's actually getting created right now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just create a fake commit again on this one to just trigger this entire workflow. And I'm going to say git commit. So this should fire my webhook, and that should trigger this particular job here in a few seconds now. Yep, there you go. So it triggered the job, and it's going to run through all the Docker build and workflow. So I'm going to let the pipeline run. So if I kind of click on it, I can actually see the workflow. It's trying to generate the job definition, and it will run through in a few seconds. Yep, there you go. So it's starting to provision a node from a build container, and this should run through the entire workflow in a few seconds. So while I wait for that, I think this is going to run through. That's pretty much all the workflow I had end to end. What you're going to see now is this trigger one by one and run through. In the meantime, so if I have any questions, Manisha, do we have any questions that I can answer while we wait for this to build and actually run through the entire workflow?
So I don't see any questions in the GoToWebinar panel. So if anyone has any questions, this is a good time to ask so that we can answer.
So we have about 15 minutes. So while this finishes, this takes about 2 to 3 minutes to run and provision the node and run through this entire workflow. But I'm happy to answer any questions, anything that people would want to see a little bit more deeply. Another thing, while this is running, what I'll do is I'll just show you this. I showed you a sample demo. I want to actually show you how Shippable's pipeline looks like. So we use Shippable to actually build Shippable. It's one of the best advantages we have is a lot of these features are things that we have built that we needed, as opposed to, hey, saying somebody might need this. So I'll just kind of show you how our pipeline looks like.
So Avi, there is a question. Do we have any plans for better integration support with AWS Cloud Formations?
Yes, so we are planning to add that as just like Terraform as an integration. So we started adding Terraform as the basic thing, and a lot of our customers started using Terraform, or were using Terraform. We are hearing a lot of more folks using CloudFormation, and we are happy to add that as an integration. If somebody needs it, I mean, usually adding an integration for us is about a week, and we are kind of customer driven. So if somebody comes out and says, hey, I absolutely need this, we usually turn it around in a week and you'll have that running. But in the meantime, it's actually in the pipeline for March for us to get that added into the March release. So what you're seeing now is the run CLI running. It's going through its workflow. I'm going to let this, I mean, if you see, I just canceled it. I should have actually left it on. So it's starting to download and build a Docker container. And once it's done, it'll push the Docker container, which will actually trigger the entire deployment. We can watch it. Any other questions out there? So I'll show you the shippable pipeline. So this is our pipeline. This is like all of our infrastructure provisioning. We have alpha, RC, and production as 3 different workflows. So these are all the infrastructure provisioning. We use DryDoc as a way to create all our build images. That gets pushed to Microbase, and Microbase is what we use for all our microservices, including, I mean, everything is a microservice for us, and all of that gets built in from one single image as the base. And the reason why we do this is because of patching. So assume that if you had a heartbleed kind of an issue, all I have to do is my team has to come and patch Microbase, and if this gets patched, my entire pipeline gets rebuilt all the way through, goes into release alpha, and then gets pushed to alpha, as in all the tags get created as alpha, And if you'll see here, we are doing release management here, so automatically version numbers are getting updated dynamically when we do a release. That gets tagged in push alpha, and then that gets deployed to alpha. And we have two versions of alpha. There's a core version and a regular alpha version, which it gets deployed to. And then once it's deployed, actually, my build acceptance test is failing right now. So somebody is doing development and some tests are failing. So this is kind of the alpha workflow. Now, if that succeeds, somebody is going to come in and say, I want to release an RC. They can just right click and say release RC. That triggers the entire workflow of push RC, deploy to RC, and then run through RC smoke test. And eventually, if that runs, then somebody comes and says release final, and you get an actual final build out. So the entire workflow, even though we are kind of doing completely automated workflows, there's still production deployment and RC deployment is triggered manually. But from our perspective, the trigger is just about right-clicking and saying run this job, and that's about it. And that's how we actually deploy and run end-to-end, how Shippable actually runs. So let's just actually jump back here. Oh, I just see that the build Docker file finished, the Docker manifest got generated, and now we are actually doing a deployment into ECS, and we should see that service come up in ECS very, very, very soon. So that's kind of the pipeline end to end. What I also had is like something like I want to show you the sit part. So you can actually also create a very simple smoke test kind of a job like this, which is a system integration test that we have created. And it has its own repo with its own configuration. I can just commit that, and you should see so now the pipeline will get updated so that once test is finished, then actually sit also can run on top of it. So that's kind of like instead of doing a blind deployment where I deploy to test, I need to manually test, and then I have to deploy to production, I can actually also create a sit integration, which will just get added the moment this is finished. So if I jump back into AWS now, you should actually see these services to start come up there. So if you see there's a service that came up here, this is just deployed right now. And if I go in, this is the IP address of this. That's the Tomcat server that's default. And then if I type hello world, this is the application, and say ECS webinar. So this is working. So this was the simple test. It's just a very, very simple application. So my test is working. So what I can now do is just right click on my production and say run my production deployment. And if you see now, just now ECS got created, SIT got created, and SIT is going to run after test. So this is running. So if I should be able to go to ECS. So there are two pending tasks right now, which is actually the two tasks that are getting deployed. So if you see desired count is 2, pending count is 2, it is starting to deploy these two. So the reason why you're seeing 2 containers now is because my scalar unit was actually 2, and hence it actually deployed 2 containers instead of 1. So that's how you can actually control now in the system. If you remember, this is the replicas. If I make this 1, it'll actually downgrade. If I make this 3, it'll upgrade to 3 containers. If it actually runs a new version of it, it will do a rolling upgrade. You could also do blue-green. You could also do canary-based deployments, those kind of things on top those are all kind of baked in as different deployment strategies into the system. So this just started running. Obviously, I can go to this one too and go to the IP address, and you'll see the same application that's running at this particular application. Now, if you see one last thing is that if you see now, the way this is set up is demo test is firing system integration test. Let's assume I don't like the way this is running. I want to actually make this depend on this. It's a very simple change. All I have to do is come in here and say, instead of after this finishes, this is saying I'm going to wait on demo test. I'm just going to change this one simple field here and say, I want that to be on switch and I want to turn off switch. And if I commit this, you'll see the switch happen, and now you're doing continuous deployment with completely no workflow. So the idea is, now there you go, it's starting to run. It should take about 10 seconds. What should happen is, what I want to do now is, if demo test gets deployed, fire system integration test automatically. And if system integration test goes green, then automatically deploy to production, because I trust my system integration tests to catch all the bugs. I mean, that's basically what I just did. And that's the power of declarative YAML, is that you're just changing names and pointers, and your system is actually changing. You can completely alter your pipeline. If you kind of do this with scripts, you'll have to now go and change a bunch of scripts and change a bunch of things to actually make this thing actually work. So you should see this now switch in like a few seconds. Manisha, do we have, and there you go. So if you see, what I just now did was, I just switched my dependency. Now test will fire sit. Sit will actually deploy to prod. And I've not run sit yet, and that's why it's still gray. And the other thing you will get is, you will get full history, like all the jobs here. You can go, like, I mean, if I switch into Shippable and I click on something here, oops, I think I'll use this. Manisha, do we have any more questions? We have a few minutes left.
Yes, actually, there is one more. Are these example repos public, so we can use your YAML files as an example reference?
Yes, they're all public. I think what we'll do is, after the webinar, we'll send it out to everybody, all the repo links, and these are all like sitting under my repository. So if you want to do it before, yeah, I mean, this thing came up. So if you see here, I can see the full history of everything that has happened since push alpha was deployed. So I can go to any one of this, I can see the version. So you get complete auditability of who triggered it, what triggered, when, how long it ran. And that's, all of that is completely given to you, so that you don't need to really have to store any offline data. Everything is part of the system. And this is the power of state that we are maintaining. So it's, if you wanna, we'll send this out, but it's actually under GitHub/AVINCI. That's my alias, and you should see it. And there are two repositories here, demo pipes and sample Java Tomcat. So these two repositories were the two repositories I was using for this demo. Any other questions?
Yeah, there's one more about plans for integration support with AWS CloudFormation.
Yeah, we answered that, right? So we're going to do that in March. It's currently on the plan for March. Okay.
I don't think there are any more.
Okay. Thank you very much, everybody. I hope this was informative and useful, and it just gives you a kind of like a idea of how end-to-end pipelines, and when we call systematic DevOps, what we are kind of thinking about. Hopefully you get to try out, and feel free to send us an email if you have any questions, or drop us a note, and we'll be happy to answer. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much, everyone, for attending. We're going to go ahead and sign off. As Avi mentioned, we've got the sample repos and these slides will be published and available, as well as the recording of today's session will be available afterwards as well. And so we'll send out an email with those links following within the next few days. We also have an additional repository called in GitHub called Shippable Samples that has a variety of other configurations of different features within Shippable that you can leverage as well, and we'll include that link in those mails as well. So thanks again, everyone. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to any of us via email or on our support repo on GitHub. With that, we'll close out the session. Thank you.